The golden morning light filtered through the tall windows of Rosewood Castle as Princess Isabella stood in her private chambers. Her heart was beating fast as she looked at the official letter in her hands. The royal seal was broken, and the words on the paper would change her life forever. Today was the day she had been dreading for months. Prince David was 3 floors below in the castle gardens, walking among the white roses. He carried a similar letter with the same royal seal. His hands shook slightly as he read the words again. The king had made his final decision about the marriage arrangements. There was no turning back now. Isabella had known this day would come since she was a small child. Royal children were taught early that their marriages would be arranged by their parents for the good of the kingdom. Love was a luxury that princesses could not afford. Duty came first above all other feelings. But knowing something would happen and actually facing it were 2 very different things. Isabella had spent sleepless nights over the past few weeks thinking about leaving everything she had ever known. The castle where she was born, the gardens where she played as a child, the people who had watched her grow up. Most importantly, she would have to leave David. David crumpled the letter in his hand and sat down on the stone bench beside the fountain. The water bubbled cheerfully as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Isabella would be leaving. In 3 days, to marry Prince Marcus of the neighboring kingdom of Westbridge, the marriage would create a powerful alliance between their 2 kingdoms and end years of tension along their borders. The servants in the castle were already preparing. For Isabella's departure, they packed her belongings into large wooden trunks. Her beautiful gowns and jewelry would travel with her to her new home. Her books and personal treasures would make the journey to everything except her happiness. David and Isabella had been best friends since childhood. Their kingdoms had been allies for many years, and royal visits were common. Isabella's family would spend summers at David's castle, while David's family would visit during the winter months. The 2 children had grown up together, playing the same games and sharing the same dreams. As they got older, their friendship had slowly turned into something deeper. They would walk together in the gardens, talking about books they had read and places they wanted to visit. They would dance together at royal balls and laugh at the same jokes. They understood each other in a way that no one else could. But Isabella was promised to another prince in a marriage that had been arranged years ago. Prince Marcus was a good man by all accounts. He was kind and intelligent and would make a fine husband. But he was not David. Isabella had met Marcus only twice, and both meetings had been formal and proper. There had been no laughter or easy conversation, no shared memories or inside jokes. David stood up from the bench and began walking toward the castle. He knew Isabella would be in her room, reading the same letter he had just received. He wanted to see her and talk to her about what they would do. But he also knew that seeing her would make everything more painful. The castle staff had been whispering about the upcoming marriage for weeks. Everyone knew that Isabella and David cared deeply for each other. The older servants remembered when they were children and how they had always been inseparable. Some of the younger maids had even been romantic enough to hope that somehow the 2 would find a way to be together. But fairy tales did not happen in real life. Royal marriages were business arrangements designed to strengthen kingdoms and create peace between neighbors. Personal feelings were not considered when such important decisions were made. The happiness of 2 young people was less important than the safety and prosperity of thousands of citizens. Isabella's mother, Queen Catherine, knocked softly on her daughter's door. She entered the room and found Isabella sitting by the window. Looking out at the gardens below, the queen's heart ached for her daughter, but she also understood the necessity of the arrangement. She had been in a similar situation many years ago when she married Isabella's father. Queen Catherine sat down beside Isabella and took her hand. She spoke gently about the duties that came with being born into a royal family. She explained how the marriage to Prince Marcus would bring peace and prosperity to both kingdoms. She reminded Isabella that she had been raised to put the needs of her people before her own desires. Isabella listened to her mother's words and nodded politely. She understood everything the queen was saying. She knew that her marriage was not just about her own life, but about the lives of everyone in the kingdom. She knew that personal sacrifice was expected from those who were born to rule. But understanding something and accepting it were 2 different things. Isabella's heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. She thought about all the conversations she would never have with David, all the walks in the garden they would never take, all the books they would never read together, all the dreams they would never share. David was having similar thoughts as he walked through the castle corridors. He passed the library where he and Isabella had spent countless hours reading and talking. He walked by the music room where Isabella would play the piano while he listened. Every room held memories that would soon be nothing more than painful reminders of what could have been. The next 3 days would be the most difficult of their lives. They would have to say goodbye to each other and to the future they had both secretly hoped for. They would have to smile and act happy about the marriage arrangements, even though their hearts were breaking. They would have to pretend that duty was more important than love, even though every part of them wanted to rebel against the unfairness of it all. As the sun began to set over the castle grounds, both Isabella and David knew that their time together was running out. Soon they would be separated by distance and duty and the expectations of their royal positions. The love they shared would have to become a secret memory that they carried in their hearts forever. The second day dawned gray and cloudy, as if the sky itself was mourning what was about to happen. Isabella woke before sunrise and found herself unable to return to sleep. She dressed quietly and slipped out of her room while the castle was still, peaceful, and quiet. She needed to walk and think before the busy preparations for her departure began again. David had also risen early and was already in the castle stables. He often came here when he needed to think clearly. The horses were calm and peaceful companions who asked no questions and made no judgments. He brushed his favorite horse Thunder while his mind raced with thoughts he could not share with anyone else. The head groom, Thomas, noticed that David seemed troubled. Thomas had worked in the royal stables for over 20 years and had watched David grow from a small boy into a young man. He could see that something was weighing heavily on the prince's mind, but he was wise enough not to ask questions about royal matters. Isabella found herself walking toward the old oak tree at the far end of the castle grounds. This tree had been special to her and David since they were children. They had carved their initials in the bark when they were 10 years old. They had climbed its branches and hidden among its leaves during games of hide-and-seek. They had sat beneath its shade reading books and sharing secrets. The tree stood tall and strong, just as it had for hundreds of years. Isabella touched the bark where their initials were still visible after all these years. D&I surrounded by a heart that now seemed to mock the impossible situation they found themselves in. She wondered if anyone would remember their friendship. After she was gone, back in the castle, the servants were working busily to prepare for Isabella's departure. Her trunks were being filled with everything she would need in her new home. Wedding gifts from various noble families were being carefully packed and labeled. The kitchen staff was preparing special foods for her journey to Westbridge, Mrs. Henderson. The head housekeeper supervised all the preparations with her usual efficiency. She had served the royal family for 30 years and had helped prepare for many important events. But this departure felt different from the others. She could see the sadness in Isabella's eyes, and it made her own heart heavy. David finished grooming Thunder and decided to ride out into the countryside. He needed to get away from the castle and all the reminders of what was happening. The horse seemed to understand his mood and ran swiftly across the open fields. The wind in David's face helped clear his thoughts, but it could not clear the pain. From his heart, as he rode, David remembered all the times he and Isabella had explored these same fields together. They had raced their horses across the meadows and stopped to pick wildflowers by the streams. They had shared picnic lunches under the summer sun and talked about their dreams for the future. Dreams that would never come true now. Isabella remained under the oak tree as the morning progressed. She thought about the letter she had received from Prince Marcus the day before. He had written kind words about looking forward to their marriage and their life together. He seemed like a good man who would treat her well, but kindness was not the same as love. She tried to imagine what her life would be like in Westbridge. She would have new duties and responsibilities as a princess of that kingdom. She would meet new people and learn new customs. She would have to create a new life for herself, far away from everything familiar. The thought both frightened and saddened her. Lady Margaret, one of Isabella's closest friends, came looking for her around midday. Margaret had been Isabella's companion since they were both young girls. She was one of the few people who truly understood how Isabella felt about leaving. Margaret had also been born into nobility and understood the burden of duty that came with their positions. Margaret sat down beside Isabella under the oak tree. She did not speak immediately, but simply offered her presence as comfort. Sometimes the most important thing a friend could do was just be there during difficult times. The two young women sat in comfortable silence, watching the clouds move across the sky. David returned to the castle in the afternoon and went directly to the library. This room held so many memories of time spent with Isabella: the comfortable chairs by the window where they used to read together, the shelves of books they had discussed and shared, the writing desk where Isabella would practice her letters while David studied maps of distant kingdoms. He pulled out a book of poetry that Isabella had given him for his birthday 2 years ago. She had marked several pages with her favorite poems about love and friendship. Reading her carefully written notes in the margins made David feel close to her, even though they were apart. He wondered if she would be able to take any books with her to Westbridge. As evening approached, Isabella knew she had to return to the castle. There would be a formal dinner that night, with visiting nobles who had come to wish her well on her upcoming marriage. She would have to smile and accept their congratulations while her heart was breaking. She would have to pretend to be happy about a future she did not want. The dinner was held in the great hall, which was decorated with flowers and candles. For the occasion, Isabella wore her finest gown and her mother's pearls. She looked every inch the perfect princess, but inside, she felt hollow and lost. David was seated across the table from her, but they could barely look at each other without showing their true feelings. The conversation at dinner centered around the upcoming marriage and the benefits it would bring to both kingdoms. The guests spoke enthusiastically about the alliance and the peace it would create. They praised Isabella for her sacrifice and her dedication to duty. Each compliment felt like a knife in her heart. After dinner, Isabella excused herself and went to her room early. She needed to be alone with her thoughts and feelings. Tomorrow would be her last full day at the castle. Tomorrow she would have to begin saying goodbye to everything and everyone she loved. Tomorrow she would have to start preparing her heart for a life without David. David also left the dinner early and went to his own chambers. He stood at his window looking out at the gardens where he and Isabella had walked so many times together. The moonlight made everything look silver and magical, but the beauty only made his sadness deeper. He wondered how he would live the rest of his life, knowing that his one true love was married to someone else. The third morning arrived with unexpected sunshine that seemed to mock the darkness in Isabella's heart. This was her final day at the castle before departing for Westbridge. She had barely slept during the night, thinking about all the things she needed to say and do before leaving forever. The weight of finality pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe normally. David had spent the entire night pacing in his room, unable to find any peace or rest. He kept thinking about the conversation he needed to have with Isabella before she left. There were words that had never been spoken between them, feelings that had been carefully hidden behind the mask of friendship. If he did not speak now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. The castle was bustling with activity from the early morning hours. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying Isabella's final belongings to be loaded onto the carriages. The kitchen staff prepared food for her journey, while the stable hands readied the horses that would carry her away from everything she had ever known. Isabella's personal maid Sarah helped her dress in a traveling gown of deep blue silk. Sarah had been with Isabella since she was a child and was one of the few people who truly understood how much this departure was costing the young princess. Sarah's eyes were red from crying as she carefully arranged Isabella's hair and packed her final personal items. Queen Catherine came to Isabella's room to spend these last precious hours with her daughter. The Queen sat on the bed where Isabella had slept as a child and told her stories about her own arranged marriage many years ago. She spoke honestly about the difficulty of leaving home and family, but also about the strength that came from doing one's duty. The Queen explained how she had learned to find happiness in her new life, even though it was not the life she had dreamed of as a young girl. She had grown to love Isabella's father over time and had found purpose in serving their kingdom. She assured Isabella that she too would find ways to create joy and meaning in her new role as Princess of Westbridge. Meanwhile, David was in the castle chapel, kneeling before the altar where his family had prayed for generations. He asked for strength and guidance about what he should do. Part of him wanted to fight against the marriage arrangements and find some way to keep Isabella from leaving but he knew that such actions would only bring pain and trouble to both their families. The morning hours passed too quickly as Isabella made her final preparations. She visited the castle library one last time to choose a few special books to take with her. She selected the volume of poetry that David had given her, and a collection of fairy tales that had been her childhood favorite. Each book would be a connection to her old life in her new home. Isabella also spent time with the castle staff, who had cared for her throughout her life. She thanked the gardeners who had taught her about flowers and the kitchen maids who had snuck her extra sweets when she was small. She embraced the older servants who had watched her grow from a baby into a young woman. Each goodbye was harder than the last dot. David finally gathered his courage and went to find Isabella around midday. He discovered her in the music room, sitting at the piano, where she had played so many beautiful songs over the years. Her fingers moved slowly across the keys, playing a melancholy melody that seemed to match the sadness in both their hearts. He entered the room quietly and sat in the chair where he had listened to her play countless times before. For several minutes they remained in comfortable silence as the music filled the space between them. The melody spoke of all the emotions they had never put into words: love and loss and the pain of impossible dreams. When the song ended, Isabella turned to face David with tears shining in her eyes. She had been waiting for this moment and dreading it at the same time. She knew that whatever they said to each other now would have to last them for the rest of their lives. There would be no other opportunities for complete honesty between them. David took her hands in his and finally spoke the words that had been locked in his heart for so long. He told her that he loved her more than his own life. He said that she had been his dearest friend and his greatest joy since childhood. He explained that watching her leave would be the hardest thing he had ever done, but that he understood why it had to happen. Isabella listened to his words with her heart breaking and mending at the same time. She had always known that David cared for her, but hearing him say it aloud made it both more real and more painful. She told him that she loved him too, and that she would carry that love with her always, even though she could never act upon it. Talked about their childhood memories and the dreams they had shared. They spoke about the books they had read together and the places they had hoped to visit someday. They discussed the kind of life they might have had if they had been born into different circumstances. Each memory was precious and painful. At the same time, as the afternoon wore on, they both knew that their private time together was coming to an end. Soon, Isabella would have to join her family for the final farewell ceremony. The carriages were already waiting in the courtyard, and the guards who would escort her to Westbridge were making their final preparations. David gave Isabella a small wrapped package and asked her not to open it until she reached Westbridge. He explained that it was something to remember him by and to remind her that she would always have a friend who cared about her happiness. Isabella accepted the gift with trembling hands, knowing that it would be one of her most treasured possessions. Isabella gave David a letter that she had written during the sleepless night before. She asked him to read it only after she had gone, because she knew that saying goodbye would be difficult enough without additional tears. The letter contained all the words she could not speak aloud and all the feelings she would have to keep hidden in her new life. The sun began to set as they made their way to the great hall, where the final farewell ceremony would take place. Isabella's family and the visiting nobles were already assembled. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, as if this were a celebration rather than a heartbreaking departure. Isabella would have to smile and accept their good wishes, while her world fell apart around her. The great hall was decorated with flowers and banners for Isabella's farewell ceremony, but the beautiful decorations could not hide the sadness that filled the room. Noble families from across the kingdom had gathered to wish the princess well. On her journey to Westbridge, everyone smiled and spoke cheerfully about the upcoming marriage, but Isabella could see the pity in their eyes. David stood with his family near the front of the hall wearing his formal court attire. His face showed no emotion, but his hands were clenched tightly at his sides. He had practiced this moment in his mind many times, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of watching Isabella. Prepared to leave forever, Isabella entered the hall, wearing a traveling dress of royal purple with her mother's diamond necklace. She walked slowly down the center aisle toward where her family waited. Every step felt like a small death as she moved further away from her old life and closer to her uncertain future. The assembled nobles bowed as she passed, but she barely Notice them? King Edward Isabella's father stood at the front of the hall, beside a large table covered with official documents. These papers would formalize the marriage agreement between the kingdoms and make Isabella's departure legally binding. Once the documents were signed, there would be no way to change what was happening. The king began the ceremony by speaking about the importance of duty and sacrifice in royal life. He explained how Isabella's marriage would bring peace and prosperity to both kingdoms. He praised his daughter for her willingness to serve her people even when it required personal sacrifice. Each word felt like a weight pressing down on Isabella's chest. Queen Catherine fought back tears as she listened to her husband's speech. She remembered her own farewell ceremony many years ago when she had left her childhood home to marry into Isabella's father's family. The pain never completely went away, but it did become easier to bear over time. She hoped Isabella would find the same strength she had discovered. The ceremony continued with representatives from Westbridge speaking about their kingdom and their excitement about welcoming Isabella as their new princess. They described the beautiful castle where she would live and the kind people she would meet. They spoke about Prince Marcus and his eagerness to begin their married life together. Isabella listened politely to all the speeches, but her mind was focused on David, who stood silently across the room. She memorized every detail of his face, knowing that these might be the last moments she would ever see him. She tried to send him a message with her eyes that she would never forget him, or the love they shared. When the speeches ended, it was time for Isabella to sign the marriage documents. She walked to the table where a golden pen waited beside the official papers. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen and prepared to sign away her freedom. The ink seemed to flow like tears across the expensive parchment. Each signature made her departure more real and more final. She signed her name as Princess Isabella of Rosewood for the last time. Tomorrow, she would be Princess Isabella of Westbridge, and her old identity would exist only in memories. She felt like she was signing away not just her future, but also her very soul. The crowd applauded politely when the documents were completed, but there was no real joy in the sound. Everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing a sacrifice rather than a celebration. Isabella curtsied to acknowledge their approval, but inside she felt completely empty and lost. King Edward announced that the carriages were ready, and that it was time for Isabella to begin her journey to Westbridge. The trip would take 3 days, and Isabella would be accompanied by a large escort of guards and servants. She would travel in comfort, but she would also be traveling toward a life she did not want. Isabella began making her individual farewells to the assembled nobles and court members. Each person offered her their best wishes and promised to remember her fondly. Some of the older ladies pressed small gifts into her hands, while others simply squeezed her fingers in understanding. The younger nobles seemed envious of her upcoming marriage, but Isabella would have gladly traded places with any of them. When Isabella reached David in the receiving line, time seemed to stop completely. They looked into each other's eyes for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. David bowed formally and wished her happiness in her new life. Isabella curtsied and thanked him for his friendship over the years. The words were proper and polite, but their eyes said everything that their voices could not. David wanted to reach out and touch her hand one final time, but too many people were watching. Instead, he stepped back and allowed her to continue down the line of well-wishers. The moment passed so quickly that it felt like a dream, but the pain in his chest was completely real. Isabella's final goodbye was to her parents, who would escort her to the courtyard where the carriages waited. Queen Catherine embraced her daughter tightly and whispered words of encouragement in her ear. She reminded Isabella that she would always be loved and that her family would never forget her. King Edward kissed his daughter's forehead and told her how proud he was of her courage. The procession moved from the great hall through the castle corridors toward the main entrance. Isabella tried to memorize every detail of the castle as she walked through it for the last time. The tapestries on the walls that told stories of her ancestors, the suits of armor that had belonged to ancient knights, the portraits of family members who had lived and died within these walls. Outside in the courtyard, 6 royal carriages waited in the afternoon sunlight. Isabella's personal belongings had already been loaded, along with wedding gifts from various noble families. The horses stamped their feet impatiently, as if they were eager to begin the journey. Isabella wished she could share their enthusiasm, but all she felt was dread. The head of her escort, Captain Williams, helped Isabella into the lead carriage. The interior was luxurious, with soft cushions and silk curtains, but it felt like a beautiful prison. Through the window, Isabella could see David standing with the crowd that had gathered to see her departure. She pressed her hand against the glass, wishing she could somehow reach him. As the carriages began to move, Isabella took her last look at the castle, where she had spent her entire life. The building grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared, completely behind the hills. With it went her childhood, her dreams, and the only love she would ever know. The first night of Isabella's journey was spent at an inn halfway between Rosewood and Westbridge. The innkeeper and his wife had prepared their finest rooms for the royal party, but Isabella barely noticed the comfortable surroundings. By the window, looking out at the unfamiliar countryside, wondering if David was looking at the same stars she could see in the dark sky. Her traveling companion, Lady Margaret, tried to engage her in conversation during dinner, but Isabella could barely manage to eat a few bites of food. Everything tasted like dust in her mouth, and her stomach felt twisted with anxiety about what lay ahead. She excused herself early and went to her room, where she finally opened the package. David had given her Dot. Inside the carefully wrapped box was a small silver locket with an intricate design of two birds flying together. Isabella opened the locket and found a tiny portrait of David inside, along with a pressed flower from their special oak tree. The sight of his face brought tears to her eyes, and she held the locket close to her heart as she cried herself to sleep. Meanwhile, back at Rosewood Castle, David was in his room reading the letter Isabella had given him. Her words spoke of love and gratitude and hope that somehow they would both find happiness despite being apart. She thanked him for all the joy he had brought to her life and promised that she would never forget their friendship. The letter made him feel both comforted and heartbroken at the same time. The second day of Isabella's journey took her through rolling hills and small villages where people came out to wave at the royal carriages. Children ran alongside the horses, throwing flower petals while their parents bowed respectfully. Isabella tried to smile and wave back, but her heart was not in the performance. She felt like she was watching someone else's life through the carriage. Captain Williams rode beside her carriage and tried to distract her with stories about the places they were passing through. He told her about the history of various landmarks and the legends associated with certain hills and rivers. His kind efforts were appreciated, but nothing could lift the heavy sadness that had settled over Isabella like a dark cloud as they traveled. Further from Rosewood, the landscape began to change. The familiar oak trees gave way to pine forests, and the gentle hills became steeper mountains. Even the air smelled different, with hints of salt from the ocean that bordered Westbridge. Every mile took Isabella further from everything she had ever known and closer to a completely new life. During the afternoon, they stopped to rest the horses at a small village in. The local people were excited to see a royal princess and gathered around the carriages, hoping to catch a glimpse of Isabella. She stepped out briefly to stretch her legs and was touched by the warm welcome from the villagers. Their genuine happiness helped lift her spirits slightly. An old woman approached Isabella and pressed a small carved wooden bird into her hands. The woman explained that it was a traditional good luck charm that would bring happiness to new brides. Isabella was moved by the simple gesture and thanked the woman with tears in her eyes. The kindness of strangers reminded her that there were good people everywhere, even in places far from home. That evening, they reached the border between Rosewood and Westbridge, where officials were waiting to welcome Isabella to her new kingdom. The border ceremony was brief but formal, with documents to be signed and official greetings to be exchanged. Isabella realized that crossing this invisible line meant she was no longer just visiting Westbridge, but was now officially becoming part of it. The third and final day of travel brought them to the outskirts of Westbridge Castle. Isabella could see the tall towers and flags in the distance, and her heart began beating faster with nervousness. Soon she would meet Prince Marcus again and begin the life that had been planned for her. She tried to prepare herself mentally for what was about to happen. The castle of Westbridge was impressive and beautiful, but it looked nothing like her childhood home. The architecture was different, with pointed spires instead of round towers. The gardens were formal and geometric, rather than the wild natural beauty she was used to. Everything was lovely, but foreign and intimidating. Prince Marcus was waiting in the courtyard with his parents and a large group of nobles to welcome Isabella. He looked handsome and dignified in his royal robes, and Isabella reminded herself that she was fortunate to be marrying such a well-regarded prince. Many princesses had been forced into much worse situations than hers. When Isabella stepped out of her carriage, Prince Marcus came forward to greet her with a formal bow, her hand, and kissed it gently while speaking words of welcome to his kingdom. His touch was warm, but it did not make her heart race the way David's had. She curtsied politely and thanked him for his kind reception. The welcoming ceremony included speeches from various nobles and officials about the benefits of the marriage alliance. Isabella listened carefully and responded appropriately, but part of her mind was still back at Rosewood, thinking about David. She wondered what he was doing at this exact moment and whether he was thinking about her too. That evening there was a grand feast in Isabella's honor with music and dancing and elaborate decorations. She wore her finest gown and tried to appear happy and grateful for all the attention. Prince Marcus was attentive and courteous throughout the evening, making sure she felt comfortable and welcome among his people. During the dancing, Isabella noticed that Prince Marcus was a skilled dancer who moved with grace and confidence. He was clearly well-educated and cultured with knowledge about art and literature and politics. She could see why he was considered an excellent choice for a husband and future king. Any other princess would have been thrilled to marry him, but Isabella's heart belonged to someone else, and no amount of admirable qualities could change that fact. She performed her duties as the guest of honor, but inside she felt like she was acting in a play about someone else's life. The real Isabella was still back at Rosewood under the oak tree with David. As the evening drew to a close, Prince Marcus escorted Isabella to her temporary chambers where she would stay until their wedding. In 2 days, he thanked her for agreeing to the marriage and expressed his hope that they would find happiness together. His words were sincere and kind, but they only made Isabella feel more guilty about her inability to return his feelings. Alone in her room, Isabella touched the silver locket David had given her and made a silent promise to try her best to be a good wife to Prince Marcus, even though her heart would always belong to someone else. The morning of Isabella's wedding dawned bright and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Westbridge Castle. The entire kingdom was celebrating the royal marriage that would unite their land with Rosewood in lasting peace. Flowers decorated every street and church, bells rang across the countryside, announcing the joyous occasion to all who could hear them. Isabella woke early and spent a long time looking at herself in the mirror while her new ladies-in-waiting prepared her wedding dress. The gown was magnificent, with layers of white silk and hundreds of tiny pearls sewn into intricate patterns. The veil had been worn by Marcus's grandmother and his great-grandmother before her. Everything was perfect and beautiful, but Isabella felt like she was preparing for her own funeral. At Rosewood Castle, David also woke before dawn, unable to sleep, on this day that would change everything forever. He knew that in a few hours Isabella would become someone else's wife, and their childhood love would have to become nothing more than a cherished memory. He dressed carefully and went to the castle chapel to pray for Isabella's happiness in her new life. The wedding preparations at Westbridge continued throughout the morning, with servants rushing everywhere to make sure every detail was perfect. The great cathedral was decorated with white roses and golden ribbons, while musicians practiced the ceremonial music that would accompany Isabella down the aisle. The kitchen staff prepared a feast that would feed hundreds of wedding guests from both kingdoms. Isabella's mother, Queen Catherine, had arrived the night before to help her daughter prepare for the most important day of her life. She spent the morning braiding Isabella's hair with white flowers and sharing stories about her own wedding day many years ago. She tried to offer comfort and encouragement, but she could see the sadness in Isabella's eyes, despite all her efforts. To hide it, Prince Marcus was also preparing for the ceremony in his own chambers across the castle. His best friend, Lord Richard, helped him dress in his formal wedding attire while offering jokes and stories to calm his nerves. Marcus seemed excited about marrying Isabella, but he had also noticed her quiet sadness since her arrival. He hoped that in time she would learn to be happy in their marriage. The cathedral began filling with guests several hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Noble families from both kingdoms arrived in their finest clothes, eager to witness. The historic union representatives from neighboring countries had also come to show their support for the alliance. The building buzzed with conversation and anticipation as everyone waited for the bride to arrive. Isabella spent her final hour as a single woman alone in the castle chapel praying for strength and guidance. She held David's silver locket in her hands and whispered a private goodbye to the love she would have to let go. She asked for forgiveness for the feelings she could not control and for the strength to be a good wife despite her broken heart. When it was time for the wedding procession to begin, Isabella felt like she was moving in a dream. The cathedral was so full of people that she could barely see the altar where Marcus waited for her. Every step down the aisle felt heavy and final, as if she was walking away from her true self and toward a stranger she would have to become. The wedding ceremony was long and formal, with ancient words spoken in Latin and English. Isabella repeated her vows in a clear, strong voice, even though inside she felt like she was betraying everything she believed about love and marriage. When Marcus placed the golden wedding ring on her finger, she thought about David and wondered if he was thinking about her at that same moment. Meanwhile, at Rosewood Castle, David was indeed thinking about Isabella as he sat alone in the library, where they had spent so many happy hours together. He imagined her walking down the aisle in her beautiful wedding dress and tried to feel happy for her, even though his own heart was breaking. He opened the book of poetry she had given him and read her favorite verses about love and loss. The wedding ceremony concluded with the bishop pronouncing Marcus and Isabella husband and wife. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause as the new couple kissed for the first time as married partners. Isabella tried to smile and look happy, but inside she felt completely empty, as if all the joy had been drained from her soul. The wedding feast that followed was magnificent, with course after course of delicious food and entertainment by the finest musicians and dancers in the kingdom. Isabella sat beside Marcus at the head table, accepting congratulations from hundreds of guests. Everyone seemed genuinely happy about the marriage and the peace it would bring to both kingdoms. As the evening progressed, Isabella began to realize that her life was not ending but changing into something different. Marcus was kind and intelligent and clearly cared about making her happy. The people of Westbridge had welcomed her with genuine warmth and affection. Perhaps she could find a different kind of happiness in this new life, even if it was not the romantic love she had dreamed of. During the dancing, Marcus proved to be a thoughtful partner who noticed when Isabella seemed tired or overwhelmed by all the attention. He made sure she had time to rest and quietly directed conversations away from topics that seemed to make her uncomfortable. His consideration and gentleness began to touch something in Isabella's heart, even though it was not the same feeling she had for David. Late in the evening, Isabella stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the castle gardens to get some fresh air and quiet time away from the celebration. The night was beautiful, with stars shining brightly in the clear sky. She touched David's locket through her dress and made a silent promise to always treasure their love, while also trying to build something meaningful with Marcus. Marcus found her on the balcony and joined her in looking up at the stars. He spoke softly about his hopes for their marriage and his commitment to treating her with respect and kindness always. He admitted that he knew arranged marriages were difficult, but expressed his belief that they could find contentment and perhaps even love together over time. Isabella listened to his words and felt a small spark of hope in her heart for the first time since leaving Rosewood. She would never stop loving David, but she began to think that maybe she could learn to care for Marcus in a different way. Their marriage might not be the fairy tale romance she had dreamed of, but it could still be something good and worthwhile. As the wedding celebration finally came to an end, Isabella realized that this was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter. She would carry David's memory in her heart forever, but she would also try to build a new life, filled with purpose and meaning. The future was uncertain, but it was still hers to shape.